Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Fusion Business Showcase. I am your host, Garrett Rhoads, the General Manager of Fusion Workplaces, and with me today is my good friend, Dr. Diana Sorrentino. So we're going to delve into some pretty cool issues today. We're glad that you're listening, and if you are watching us on YouTube or listening to us in whatever podcast channel you have, please take a moment and like and subscribe, and I'm sure Dr. D will be sharing some of her information, social media and podcasts as well. So I'm going to just jump right into it today. Dr. D, we're here. I think we met, for the first time maybe 12 years ago?
At least.
Yeah.
At least.
And I know at the time you had two businesses going, BRG Firearms Training.
That I did.
And the other is Lehigh Valley Paladin. Did you want to tell our audience a little bit about those?
Well, BRG Firearms Training Academy was specifically established for the civilian community to provide them with firearms safety training, firearms accuracy training, and an understanding of the mechanics not just of whatever handgun they may be using, but of ballistics as well. That was sort of a prelude to my colleagues and I forming Lehigh Valley Paladin, LLC, which is a firm of security and intelligence professionals where we provide a variety of services for corporate clients and government agencies in workplace investigations, security vulnerability assessments, and the like.
Awesome. And I know today our main focus is going to be on your latest projects. I know you started podcasting yourself not that long ago. Please feel free to tell our audience about where they can find that and its title. And also, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about your new book, which is actually, she's told me a little bit about it. It's really amazing. It's a great way for people to understand a topic that a lot of people struggle with trying to understand. So did you want to talk about your podcast and your book for a little bit?
Well, that's a good place to start, Garrett. I launched my podcast in May of 2023. The focus of the podcast is to provide educational content on gender diversity, transgender, and the LGBT community at large for the medical and behavioral health care professionals who provide services to this community. I have been working parallel to my other positions with the LGBTQ plus community for the past 34 years. The reason for the podcast is because medical and behavioral health care professionals receive very little training during their formal education, whether they're physicians or psychologists. So this podcast was established to provide that education. It's also very helpful and educational for the parents and families, as well as any individual within the community, to learn much more detail about the nature of the community and the medical and behavioral health care services provided. As of this current week, I'm pleased to share that the subscribers to my podcast, which is entitled Paradoxes of Gender, has reached 54 countries.
Wow, 54.
I have subscribers in 54 countries. It has exploded. It just underscores the hunger for accurate and factual information dealing with medical and behavioral issues of gender diverse and transgender issues. And it was because of the podcast that the idea surfaced for the production of my first book, which is entitled Transgender Families. If you're looking for titles for the professional, medical or behavioral health care, there are hundreds available. If you're looking for titles specifically for the individual who may be transitioning or in the process of transitioning or considering a transition between gender assignments, there's quite a bit of material available. What was lacking was accurate material provided for the parents and families. So this book was developed entitled Transgender Families, with the subtitle Understanding Gender Diversity and Being Transgender, because no one transitions alone. The book is designed to provide the resources parents and families will need to understand what their loved one is experiencing as they progress through or into their own gender affirmation.
That's pretty thorough, and I know I was interested in having you on the show only because there was a period of a number of years there where we didn't really see each other in the networking space. And then earlier this year, we ran into each other again at lunch networking events in and around here in the Lehigh Valley. And we were catching up and talking about it. And you started telling me about your book and your podcast. And it was a topic that was of interest to me only because my son, now finishing his third year of college, he hangs out in the LGBTQ plus community. And so a lot of his friends are gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, etc. And just by me visiting him at school and taking his friends out to lunch and getting to know them a little bit better, I myself learned a lot about that community in general. I mean, I'm certainly no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but it really allowed me to get around people who were part of that community and kind of understand where they're coming from. And what I learned was, and this is something that a lot of lay people like me may not necessarily understand. Some people out there think, oh, it's a choice. They're just choosing to change gender. And what I learned from my son's friends was, it's really not a choice. It's how you feel. And imagine if you woke up every day. I myself am a male in every sense of the word, and I tried to think about how would I feel if I woke up every day and felt like I should be a woman. It's kind of a strange place for someone like me to put myself in, but I thought about it and I realized, okay, I can kind of understand where they're coming from a little bit better. Do you want to expand on that?
I can expand on that quite a bit. A little bit of biology here in utero. A child during conception, an evolution in utero. Within the first 2 months of gestation, the genitals will form, whether it's male or female, whether it's the penis or the vagina, and it'll be discernible through an ultrasound. The mind, the brain, is still immature and undeveloped at that point within the first trimester. The brain, by default, of every fetus is female. In the latter part of the third trimester, a process known as masculinization of the brain must take place. Now you figure with an XY male fetus and testosterone would masculinize the brain away from the female default, but it is not. Synthesized estrogen, which is generated from testosterone by the aromatase enzyme, is what actually will masculinize the brain. So, if all goes well and all the notes are hit properly, you have an anatomical male fetus with a male brain that's born, and there's no conflict or incongruence between their innate identity as they grow through their prepubescent childhood into adolescence. Now, it's not uncommon that that masculinization process is interrupted. Dr. Graham Thiessen, down at the Medical School of Georgia in their research unit, he and his team have identified 21 different variants in 19 genes in the brain that interfere with the masculinization process. And if this occurs and the brain does not become masculinized for the XY fetus, you have a child born, anatomical male, but the brain is female, because that is the default value. Now the reverse can also hold true. You may have an XX female fetus in development, and there's a process through DNA and other chemical factors that will block the masculinization of the brain so that it remains in the default female state, at which point you would have a female child born, anatomy and brain are congruent. If that blockage does not take place and the brain becomes masculinized, you have an anatomical female with a male brain. And this has been documented and supported through numerous peer reviews and other research studies. But most of this has only developed since the turn of the 21st century, as technology and research has improved. Now we're going to move out of utero into brain imaging. Magnetic resonance imaging diffusion-based magnetic resonance tomography, and there are other subjects. When they conducted research study using the diffusion-based magnetic resonance tomography, which looks at the water molecules of the brain and how they flow and move, they took cisgender individuals, males and females, studied the brain, took transgender males and females and studied the brain. What they learned was that there was a definitive difference between the cisgender, male and female brains. But for the transgender men and women, their brains were a blend, a hybrid of the male and female brain. So you could say that their brain was intersexed. Now, if you look at the functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, which looks more at the brain structures and the flow of blood, again, the male and female cis individuals are different. When they examined the transgender women and the transgender men, they found that the transgender male, which was someone who was assigned female at birth, has a brain structure that virtually matches the brain structure of a cisgender male, and the transgender woman, who was assigned male at birth, has a brain structure that matches the cisgender female. So there's a lot more going on than the average person would know. And what's really fascinating is that an embryo in conception, before the fetus actually begins full development, the anatomical basis, the biological and physiological basis for either male or female exists in both. The gonads will become either ovaries or testes in an XX female with proper hormones and chromosomal balance. The gonads will travel up and become ovaries. In the XY male, with normal hormones and chromosome balance, will descend into the scrotum and become testes. The same two gonads. It depends on hormones and genetics and the chromosomes. You have in the developing fetus what's known as the Müllerian ducts and the Wolffian ducts. Wolffian ducts become part of the male reproductive and urinary system. The Müllerian ducts becomes part of the female reproductive system. In the XX female, there is a chemical, biological agent that suppresses the Wolffian ducts so that the female development will take place. And in the XY fetus, there is another chemical development that blocks the Müllerian ducts from developing female organs. And I know, Garrett, you're going to have a question or two. I can go on for an hour about this.
I was going to say, I'm sitting here trying very hard to follow it, and I am, but that actually leads me to my next question, which is about your book. And that is, as I understand it, you were telling me that the book was really written for families and friends of transgender individuals.
Correct.
So that they can understand a lot of what you're talking about. And of course, we just went over the actual biology of it, but can you tell us a little bit about the social ramifications and relationships amongst families and friends from someone who is a transgendered individual?
The issue for families is developing an understanding and then an acceptance as to the how and why. You know, for the average person, if their prepubescent child or adolescent informs them that they're going to be transitioning male to female, female to male, it's like trying to grasp a ghost in the room because they have no foundation of knowledge or understanding. And because in the current sphere, there is so much negative information, misinformation in the media, people perceive that this is, oh my God, this is a new development. Well, the reality is gender diverse, gender fluid, and transgender individuals have been around for thousands of years. This is not a new phenomenon.
So you're saying in the past it's just simply been suppressed by society?
Well, not so much so. Globally, when you look around the countries of the Pacific Rim, indigenous societies, it was a welcomed and revered part of their society. When 16th and 17th century settlers visited the North American continent, they encountered the indigenous tribes, which surprised them for two important reasons. One, they spoke English. Two, they had transgender and gender diverse individuals who were leaders in their tribes, shamans, held religious positions, and were revered as individuals with two spirits. Today, there are over 570 federally recognized indigenous tribes in the North American continent that have all these individuals. There are another 200 indigenous tribes that are not federally recognized. Let's get down to the Indian subcontinent. Within the Indian continent and the population is a group of individuals known as Hijra, H-I-J-R-A. They are in the lower caste system. But these are individuals who are assigned male at birth, who live their lives as women. They're respected, they're revered, and currently there are over 3 million Hijra in the Indian subcontinent. 2 years ago, Bangladesh established a mosque specifically for their Hijra population. When you look at the global history of gender fluid individuals, it's prolific. Ancient rabbinical texts also reflect 7 different genders. The Hasidics within the Jewish community have a ritual of bathing called mikvah for an individual who's transitioning male to female to celebrate their commencement of hormone therapy. I covered all of this in the book to provide a historical perspective. Where the challenges came in is from the colonization that took place through North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia from Western Europe. The heteronormative binary gender ideology originated in that region and was brought around the world through the colonization, where they demonized, criminalized, and suppressed the natural expression of these individuals within their communities.
Okay. I'm learning something every time I talk to you, which seems to be the norm.
So the point being is this is not a new phenomenon. Okay? I am an affirmed woman, which is the correct terminology today for someone who has transitioned male to female or female to male. I like to refer to it as my life's evolution, which took place in 1990. 34 years ago, and come January, it'll be 35 years. At the time, those of us who did pursue our gender affirmations, we did so quietly. We adopted the gender binary and got on with our lives. And we didn't have issues. But it's a lack of understanding, it's political hyperbole, pathological assumptions. For years it was considered by the American Psychiatric Association as a mental pathology, until it was proven that it is not, much in the same way that homosexuality. It took until 1973 for the American Psychiatric Association to remove it from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that they use and the psychologists use. So we've been around for a long time. But it's very difficult for people to accept and understand what it means for someone to be gender diverse or transgender if they have no historical perspective and no means of having experience like you've had the opportunity to meet with so many different individuals that it's normal. This is who we are as individuals. It is not a choice. I went through a very traumatic, emotional prepubescent childhood and adolescence because at that time there was little information available.
Yeah, you had to go to the library to be able to learn stuff because that's where the information was.
Well, I went through so many different libraries looking for information, coming up empty until I was in graduate school and found a book that referenced a support group, which led me to a second group and a third group where at an outing in New York City, I met an endocrinologist who, with his father-in-law, specialized in working with the community, in working with individuals transitioning in their lives. And that's when the floodgates of information opened for me. I have 40 years of research, which went into this book, the second book, which is currently in my publisher, and the third manuscript that I'm currently working on. It's a fascinating area of research and study. But again, for the average individual, especially for a parent of a prepubescent child or adolescent, to accept and understand the incongruence between a sex assignment in birth and their gender identity, because that's an internal, innate perception, it's almost impossible for them to grasp.
It was kind of a concept for me to have to grasp when that time came. I mean, I know that, you talked about society's previous norms and whether or not things were okay. I grew up in, white bread suburbia, not very diverse community at all, and I was pretty right wing. And even as a teenager, I'll even admit that I didn't hate gay people, but to a certain extent I was homophobic looking back on it. And it really wasn't until I started working in my later teen years in high school, and some of the people that I worked with were gay. And I realized, having worked with them for a while, like, hey, Adam's a pretty nice guy. There's nothing wrong with Adam. Adam's cool, And then I realized, it's okay to be gay. There's really not a big deal about it. And I spent the summer, I was 16, living down in New Hope, Pennsylvania, which, for those of you who don't know, has a very heavy LGBTQ plus community. And of course, being around them more, I got comfortable with people in that community simply by being around them. And I think today, now that it's more okay to be open about yourself in society, more and more people are realizing, hey, we've been around these people. I don't mean to say it that way, but we've been around members of this community all the time, and we just didn't realize it. And the more you're around them, the more you realize we're all just people. So I don't understand the schism that we still have in this particular topic in society.
Well, it's because of the heteronormative binary gender ideologies that emerged out of Western Europe. But as you brought up the LGBTQ community, specifically with gay and lesbians, what I touched on earlier about the neurobiology and the physiological aspects of development in utero, the same factors influence an individual's sexual orientation. It may not necessarily impact their identity, but it does have an impact on their orientation. Many individuals who are gender diverse or transgender, as they're working through an understanding of their own feelings, will think that maybe they're gay or lesbian, until they finally connect the dots, find the right resources or support groups to understand where they're coming from. Others just knew that they were attracted to individuals, romantically and sexually, to individuals of the same gender.
Okay. And then, I've come to learn that by being around people, but, I'm sure this book actually kind of explains that more in scientific detail, like we opened up.
Well, this book focuses specifically on transgender and gender diversity. It may touch a little bit on gay or lesbian. Mm-hmm. My second book, which is currently in the publisher's hands, which is entitled Neurobiology and Physiology of Incongruent Gender Identities and Sexual Orientations, will delve deeply into the gay and lesbian perspective of emotional and physiological development, psychological development, as it does with gender diverse and transgender individuals.
Okay. And, we're not necessarily on any sort of a time limit with these podcasts. Sometimes they're 20 minutes, sometimes they're an hour long. Depends on how the conversation goes. But one of the questions I know I wanted to ask you was, how does being transgender or any part of the LGBTQ community, I've heard you say LGBTQ, and I always add the plus because my son told me I should add the plus. What's the proper terminology to use?
Keep in mind that the terminology changes frequently.
I'm getting that sense, okay. Yeah.
The contemporary terminology is transgender, not transgenderism, not transsexual, transgender. The biological sex, which is driven by gonads, hormones, and genetics, is different from a gender identity. So even though individuals like myself who were assigned male at birth transitioned to female, okay? And in spite of the surgeries to bring the body more into physical alignment with the female form, there are still some biological elements because there is an XY chromosome buried in there somewhere. And the same thing would be the case with an XX fetus who transitioned to male.
Mm-hmm. And so, given all of that, how does this affect the business community in general, or is the business community waking up to acceptance of this community more and more? Are there still barriers to entry for people? Can you tell us a little bit about how that relates to the business community?
From my experience, I have had no issues with any business community member, any type of business in general, regardless of the market segment, or working as I do with the medical and behavioral healthcare professionals or my own medical staff that I have, my primary care physician, my gynecologist, and my cardiologist. We all get along just fine. You have individuals who will hold up the Bible and say, the Bible says this. Well, in reality, it does not. And when you look back to the era within which, whether it's the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, were written, I like to ask, what was the medical technology of the time? What was the research technology of the time versus today in developing a functional understanding of the etiology of transgender individuals, non-binary, gender diverse, gay or lesbian? The Bibles have been modified over the years. They're a historical document. People need to open up a little bit and broaden their horizons. There are some who will never adapt. I've had the privilege of doing a significant number of presentations for church groups. I had one in July I did for a retirement community, 90 people in attendance, ages 60 to 90 plus, to where I spoke about gender diversity and being transgender for about an hour and a half. I was told in advance that this elder crowd was going to be a tough crowd.
As one might imagine, yes.
Right? They accepted the information, had phenomenally excellent questions, no blowback, no criticisms. And the woman who arranged for me to provide the presentation spoke with me 2 weeks later to share how many individuals in the community who attended came up to her and said, thank you for bringing this person in because they learned so much. And this is reflective of every program I've done. Also with the number of individuals who will follow up afterwards before I leave to tell me about their transgender niece, their transgender nephew, their gay daughter. I was conducting a program for the church I attend. And 5 minutes into my presentation, this little old lady, white hair out to here, slams her fist on the table and says, if it has a penis, it's a boy. I said, well, not always. So I modified my presentation, went for an hour and a half. She didn't say anything that day, but when I saw her 2 weeks later after Mass, she approached me and said, I had no idea. I learned so much. And then she proceeded to tell me about her lesbian daughter who lives in Texas. So we became good friends. The point being is, when people are provided with credible, factual information from a reliable source, and that's always important, regardless of who's delivering the content or what the content may be, it can make all the difference in the world with breaking through previous understandings. Now, I do not work in my clinical practice with the adolescent community. I work with adults who have been struggling for years, who finally decide to come out, as you might say, and pursue their gender affirmations. However, I do work with the parents of the adolescents and the psychologists that I work with who do work with the adolescents. If the parents are having a difficult time understanding what's going on, they'll be referred to me so I can sit down, share with them the details, much more than I've shared here today, ask about my background, they'll want to know. And when the parents have concerns, it falls into two very distinct categories. One is their fear and concern of the safety for their prepubescent child or adolescent, as well as for themselves. What is the family going to say? How are the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, our social network? Is there going to be blowback? What's going to happen here? So it's a two-sided coin of significant concern. Now I want to digress a little bit because I've mentioned several occasions using the term prepubescent childhood and adolescent. And it's very, very important to delineate the two classifications, because prepubescent childhood, the children who have not entered Tanner stage 2, beginning their pubertal development, are not, under any circumstances, eligible for medical or surgical interventions if they're showing gender diverse behavior. Only in adolescence or beyond is that available. And it's important to differentiate prepubescent childhood from adolescent, because when you listen to some of the hyperbole and the pathological assumptions that are being spewed, people will say, oh, they're butchering children. We're not. Because an 8-year-old and a 16-year-old is a child. An 8-year-old and a 16-year-old are minors. So when discussing this subject matter and any medical or surgical intervention, it's imperative to differentiate between the two classifications. Now, it's not uncommon for a 3 or 5-year-old to state to mom and dad, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. And that is the typical age when a prepubescent child, early childhood, will come out consistently, insistently, and persistently that their gender identity does not coincide with the sex they were assigned at birth. If this is the case, and it becomes necessary to do so when they reach 7 or 8, so they're not dealing with a social transition in middle school or high school, the prepubescent child will be allowed to socially transition through clothing, name, and pronoun to enter school in that affirmed gender identity, so that they do not go through an incongruent puberty or have to transition while in middle school or high school.
What would you say about, I know one of the conflicts that's come up over the last couple of years does have to do with public schools. If a cis male decides, who is female, right? I got that right. Wants to be called by a female name in school, there's been some hullabaloo about the schools insisting that that be allowed, but not necessarily always with the permission of the parents. What can we learn from that particular instance? Should the parents have some say or involvement in that, in your opinion?
Yes, but I'm going to get back to that more specifically in a moment.
Okay.
Because the United States Department of Education and the Attorney General's Office have issued directives that if the parents request a school to modify documents to reflect the chosen name and pronoun of their adolescent or prepubescent child, they are required by law to do so. Now, the parents need to be in approval for this. If a prepubescent child or adolescent wants a chosen name and pronoun to be used, the school can use it. But if the parent objects, then that becomes a discussion between the parent and the school counselors. Does that answer your question?
So really there's no definitive decision, it's just these two parties have to get together and come to some level of agreement. Who ultimately has the authority in that instance?
The parents.
The parents? Okay. Because I know there's some misinformation out there that you hear.
So much misinformation.
Oh yeah, the schools do this, that, and the other thing without, parental consent. And, I just wanted to ask that question because I know that topic comes up sometimes.
There's very little, if any, development that lacks parental consent. Okay? By the time it reaches the point of social affirmation pending legal affirmation and medical or surgical affirmation. The parents have been involved, there's been a psychologist involved, possibly an endocrinologist involved, a consultant like myself, and there's a progression. Now there's a big hullabaloo as well regarding puberty blockers. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone agonists. Puberty blockers are a pause button. If you have a late pubescent child who enters Tanner stage 2, puberty, this will pause the development of secondary sex characteristics of the individual. For the assigned female at birth, this is critical to put a pause on the development of breasts. And for the male assigned at birth, to prevent the development of an Adam's apple and the deepening of the voice and development of facial hair. No hormones are introduced at this time, and this is usually between the ages of 10 and 12 for females assigned at birth and 12 to 14 for males assigned at birth. We say it's a pause button because if it turns out that the affirmation is not appropriate for the individual, you discontinue the blockers and puberty reinstates immediately.
So Mother Nature takes over, basically.
Mother Nature will take over again. Also, puberty blockers have been used since before the 60s for precocious puberty. Female assigned at birth typically will enter puberty between the ages of 10 and 12. There have been cases where that assigned female at birth will start to develop breasts and even have an early menses at ages 8 and 9, as early as 7 in some cases. That's where the puberty blocker would be used to put a pause on it until a more appropriate age to allow for Tanner stage 2 and puberty to develop in a natural sense. So we have that prepubescent child entering puberty, beginning adolescence, male or female is on puberty blockers. This is where social affirmation, name change, clothing, their appearance will begin to align with their affirmed gender identity. No hormones. If all is progressing well, by age 16, now they're eligible with clearance from their psychologist and their endocrinologist to begin cross-sex hormonal treatment. For the female assigned at birth, it'll be testosterone. For the male assigned at birth, it will initially be estradiol and aldactone. The aldactone is there to assist in the blocking of the development of testosterone in the system. Surgical interventions to bring the body into alignment with the affirmed gender would not be until after their 18th birthday or later. That is the standard protocol.
Oh, so that is the standard protocol.
Yes.
Then. Okay, so for those of you listening to us, and by the way, if you're enjoying the show, please do take a moment to send us a like, subscribe to our stuff. We'd appreciate it. And also, Dr. D is going to bring up her podcast again at the end of the show, along with her social media. Make sure you check her out. But I just wanted to kind of ask you, obviously this is a topic that you've become quite an expert in. And do you do counseling with individuals? Do you do paid speaking engagements? What exactly have you taken this wealth of knowledge? What do you do with it, professionally?
I am a nationally recognized expert on gender diversity and transgender development and issues. I do counseling for the parents of adolescents. I have a counseling office in Allentown. I also have the ability through my studio to do web-based meetings and interviews. The majority of my official work is with adults 30 plus who have suppressed their feelings of gender incongruence to comply with family, culture, and society. Many of whom married in their 20s, figuring they would attempt to bury and be able to forget how they feel. But eventually it's like a pressure cooker that will explode because it cannot be contained. So I help counsel these individuals through their acceptance. If they're married, I work with their partners to help them understand, which is usually a very tumultuous experience for both of
I
them,
can only imagine, yeah.
okay? Sometimes they're willing to accept. I interviewed a woman for one of my podcasts out of the UK who was married 7 years and finally came out to their wife that they were trans female and that they wanted to go through the full process. The wife, the partner, acknowledged at that point that she was pansexual, that she can go either direction. So she stayed with the marriage. Allison, I'm using a pseudonym here, transitioned, and they're moving along very well. I've had some cases where the partner, we're talking a cis female, who learns that their husband, partner, is transitioning to female, that wants absolutely nothing to do with it and will either throw the person out of the house or pack up and leave themselves because they don't understand it. But you cannot blame them because many of them have said, I feel like I've been cheated, I've been lied to.
I can see that point of view. It's not what they signed up for. You know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, why couldn't they be honest enough to tell me about this earlier? Well, it's all not that simple. I do a significant number of paid speaking engagements. I've had the opportunity to present at numerous colleges throughout the Midwest and here on the East Coast, schools, churches, civics groups, professional organizations like the Society for Human Resource Management, and others.
Excellent. Well, I've gotten all of my questions answered today. Is there anything you wanted to cover during this recording that you haven't touched on yet today?
Understanding gender diversity and being transgender requires a shift in perspectives away from heteronormative and binary gender ideologies. This is nothing new, and it's based on science, credible, factual, peer-reviewed clinical studies and research science, as I mentioned much earlier on. My podcast series is known as Paradoxes of Gender. You can find it through my website, which is paradoxesofgender.com. There is a link to my podcasts. I upload my podcasts to Spreaker. From Spreaker, I distribute them to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, and 30 other platforms globally. The podcasts, which were commenced in May of 2023, now have subscribers in 54 countries, even throughout the Arab world.
54 countries.
54 countries.
And the Arab world.
Yeah.
That is a little, I don't want to use the term amazing. Surprising would be a better term because given people's rudimentary and probably incorrect understanding of the Arab culture, you would think that even the concept of a transgender community is not welcome in those societies. Is that correct? Or
They have provisions, and it's in their history, of gender fluid and transgender individuals. It's a little more complex for me to jump into it because we can kill another hour just talking about that part of the world.
right.
But they do exist. The number 2 country in the world for gender affirming procedures is Iran.
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 One would not have expected that. All right, so we've talked about Paradoxes of Gender, and paradoxesofgender.com is the website. Is there anything else you'd like to go over before we close?
On my website, paradoxesofgender.com, is also a link to the page for my book. It's currently available on Amazon, and I would prefer you shop small because even your local bookstore will have access to it if they have not brought it into inventory already. And as we shared earlier, this book is designed for the parents and family, the layperson. While there is biological and scientific material included in there, it's written for the average person, in contrast to the book that's currently being processed by my publisher, Neurobiology and Physiology of Incongruent Gender Identities and Sexual Orientation, which is geared more for the professionals, medical and behavioral, and it's very heavy into science and biology, although everybody can learn from it. But if you want at least a basic understanding, start with Transgender Families. On my website, under podcasts, you'll see a list of historical topics. Each podcast runs about an hour in length. I will periodically have guests, the parents of transgender individuals, psychologists, counselors, other medical professionals to talk about their experiences working with the community.
Well, I appreciate that. And also, I want to back that up. I think for those looking to understand the transgender community, I think this is an excellent book. When you told me about it a couple months ago when we were at a networking lunch, I thought, that concept is a concept that's long overdue so that the layperson can understand what they don't understand. So without kind of hammering that topic to death, I would like to endorse the book and suggest if you're curious about that particular topic, go ahead and read it. I don't know if there's anything else out there like it.
There is not.
There is not.
The book is broken down into 6 parts, comprising 53 chapters, including a list of appendices with resources, websites, and other references, reading material, and the like. The first 3 parts encompass acceptance is protection, followed by understanding gender diversity and being transgender, transgender standards of medical and behavioral health care. Those are the first 3 parts. The next 3 parts, parts 4, is specifically geared for prepubescent childhood issues. It's only 4 chapters because there's very little that's done at that point outside of social affirmation if it's proved appropriate. The 5th part is dealing with the adolescent, and the 6th part deals with the adult in transition. Garrett, thank you for this opportunity.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today, Dr. D. It was really been an honor and a pleasure to have you on our show. And for those of you listening out there in podcast land or watching us on our YouTube channel, please take a moment and subscribe to our channels and like our stuff so that we can share this information with other people. If you're part of the business community and would like to be part of the Fusion Business Showcase, feel free to reach out to us here at fusionworkplaces.com. We'll be glad to have you on the show. Once again, this is the Fusion Workplaces podcasting studio. It is available for people to use. If you want to come on out, we'd love to host you. We'll see you again on our next broadcast, and have an awesome day.